Squares, and I do mean squares because I'm sure the only people that actually listen to any one of these, especially when it's about articles and stuff like that, are squares. Most of the more fun dudes or non-squares tend to not like these videos. It's more, they want more passion and emotion and stuff like that, which is fine. But this was actually sent to me by a liberal, believe it or not. DC is actually a liberal, black nationalist, but he's a liberal. And he sent me this article about the Monahan report. Now, somebody like DC, you would think, would not tend to agree with stuff like this, right? You would think, right? But him being a Democratic liberal, some things are obvious. And most people misplace Monahan as a neoconservative racist, right? That is not his history. If you actually read his history, read his background, and not just what people say about him, you find out that Monahan is actually a liberal, an old-fashioned liberal, not the new kind that goes left and wants to inject babies with hormones and turn them into girls. He's an old-fashioned liberal, the kind that we missed, the more pragmatic type of liberal. It's actually about doing things for reasons to actually make things better instead of an ideology. But it's actually sent to me by DC. The Black Family, 40 Years of Lies, Daniel Patrick Monahan's report. And this is from I think it's the City Report, something like City News. I think it's out of New York. Read through the megazillion words on class and income mobility and poverty in the recent New York Times series Class Matters. You still won't get a grasp of the two most basic truths on the subject. One, entrenched multi-generational poverty is largely black. And two, intricately intertwined with the collapse of the nuclear family in the inner city. Some things people don't want to admit to, or they admit to on the side. By now, these two facts shouldn't be hard to grasp. Almost 70% of black children are born to single mothers. Those mothers are far more likely than married mothers to be poor, even after post-welfare reform decline in child poverty. They're also more likely to pass that poverty on to their children. Chetty just did a work, 4 years ago? In New York Times, and also the Washington Post, that big article about the mobility of black children, especially black boys. Sophisticates often try to dodge the implications of this bleak reality by shrugging that single motherhood is an inescapable fact of modern life, affecting everyone from the Bobo Murphy Browns to the ghetto baby mamas. Not so. It is a largely low-income, disproportionately black phenomenon. The vast majority of higher-income women wait to have children until they are married. The truth is that we are now a two-family nation, separate and unequal, one thriving and intact, and the other struggling, broken, and far too often African-American. That is exactly what Monahan said back in 1965 about the black family, almost to the letter. So why does the Times, like so many who rail against inequality, fall silent on the relation between poverty and single-parent families? To answer that question and to continue the confrontation with facts that Americans still prefer not to mention in polite company, you will have to go back exactly 40 years. That was when a resounding cry of outrage echoed throughout Washington and the civil rights movement in reaction to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's Department of Labor report, warning that the ghetto family was in disarray. Entitled The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, the prophetic report prompted civil rights leaders, academics, politicians, and pundits to make a momentous and, as time has shown, tragically wrong decision about how to frame the national discussion about poverty. To go back to the political and social moment before the battle broke out over the Monahan report is to return to a time before the country's decision of black poverty had hardened into fixed orthodoxies, before phrases like blaming the victim, self-esteem, and out-of-wedlock childbearing, this term used at the time was illegitimacy, and even teen pregnancy had become current, while solving the black poverty problem seemed an immense political challenge. As a conceptual matter, it didn't seem like rocket science. Most analysts assumed that once the nation removed discriminatory legal barriers and expanded employment opportunities blacks would advance just as poor immigrants had. Yeah, that's what they thought. That's what they thought. Conditions for testing the proposition looked good. Between the 1954 Brown decision and the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, legal racism had been dismantled, and the economy was humming along. In the first 5 years of the 60s, the economy generated 7 million jobs. Yet those familiar with what was called the Negro problem were getting nervous. About half of all blacks had moved into the middle class by the mid-60s. But now progress seemed to be stalling. The rise in black income relative to that of whites steadily throughout the 50s was sputtering to a halt. More blacks were out of work in 1964 than in 1954. Most alarming, after the rioting in Harlem and Paterson, New Jersey in 1964, the problems of the northern ghettos suddenly seemed more intractable than those of the George Wallace South. Moynihan, then Assistant Secretary of Labor and one of the new class of government social scientists, remember, no matter what you thought about Moynihan, Moynihan was considered a social scientist. Among the warriors, as he puzzled over his charts, one in particular caught his eye. Instead of rates of black male unemployment and welfare enrollment running in parallel as they always had, in 1962 they started to diverge in a way that would come to be called Moynihan scissors. In the past, policymakers had assumed that if the male heads of households had jobs, women and children would be provided for. This no longer seemed true, even while black men, though still catastrophically low numbers, were getting jobs. In other words, what they were saying is that even though the black men were getting jobs, the parallels that we had seen were broken. More black women were joining the welfare rolls. Moynihan and his aides decided that a serious analysis was in order. Convinced that the Negro Revolution, a moment for equality as well for liberty, was now at risk, Moynihan wanted to make several arguments in his report. First was empirical and would quickly become indisputable. Single-parent families were on the rise in the ghetto, true. But other points were more speculative and sparked a partisan dispute that has lasted to this day. Moynihan argued that the rise in single-mother families was not due to a lack of jobs, but rather a destructive vein in ghetto culture that could be traced back to slavery and Jim Crow discrimination. I don't know how people miss that. He never said that black people were defective, okay? He said that black culture had destructive tendencies tracing all the way back to slavery and Jim Crow, which they had. You were hell. Most black people, even in 1965, were still suffering under Jim Crow. Jim Crow was not something that was like 100 years in the past. Black folks, and I know that because I was a little child and walking with my aunt in Louisiana, looking at Jim Crow in its face, and that was in 1965. Jim Crow was still in effect in Louisiana in the 1970s. It was still there. They started to dismantle it, but it was still there. Anyhow, though black sociologist E. Franklin Frazier had already introduced the idea in the 1930s, Moynihan's argument defied conventional social science wisdom. In other words, Moynihan pulled a lot of it, what he thought, a lot of his thoughts, a lot of his hypotheses from Frazier. That's why he named the report what he named it. As he wrote later, the work began in the most orthodox setting, the U.S. Department of Labor, to establish some level of statistical conciseness, what everybody knew, that economic conditions determine social conditions, whereupon it turned out that what everybody knew was evidently not so. In other words, he started out with the hypothesis just like everybody else. But when he looked at the evidence, guess what? It was something else. But Moynihan went much further than merely overthrowing familiar explanations about the cause of poverty. He also described, through the pages of the disquieting charts and graphs, the emergence of the tangle of pathology. The tangle of pathology is not a term he came up with. Clark, who's a black sociologist in Harlem that actually wrote the book, I think it was Black Ghetto, Dark Ghetto, Clark's chapter was entitled Tangle of Pathology, where he described the exact problem that Moynihan's talking about. Moynihan didn't come up with these concepts, right? Moynihan collected these concepts from black sociologists. 90% of what Monahan wrote, as far as especially for about the black family, was collected from black sociologists. He didn't make this stuff up. He went to experts that knew the stuff. People leave that out, including delinquency, joblessness, school failure, crime, fatherlessness that characterized the ghettos. It still does. Or what would come to be called the underclass behavior. Monahan may have borrowed the term pathology from Kenneth Clark. See, Kenneth Clark's Dark Ghetto, published that year, but as both a descendant and a scholar of what he called the wild Irish slums, he had written a chapter on the poor Irish in the classic Beyond Melting Pot. The Assistant Secretary of Labor was no stranger to the ghetto self-destruction. He knew the dangers it posed to the basic socializing of the family, and he suspected that the risks were magnified in the case of blacks, since their matriarchal family had the effect of abandoning men and leaving them adrift and alienated. Got to remember, Monahan grew up in a single-family household. Okay, his father left. Monahan knew what a single family was. Growing up with a single mother. Even though he was not a bastard, he was legitimized. What most people do. His father left. His mother was left on her own. He grew up in a single-family household. More than most social scientists, Monahan had steeped in history and anthropology, understood what families do. They shape their children's character and ability, he wrote. By and large, adult conduct in society is learned as a child. What children learned in the disorganized homes of the ghetto, as he described through his force of grasp, was that adults do not finish school, get jobs, or in the case of men, take care of the children or obey the law. Marriage, on the other hand, provides a stable home for children to learn common virtues. Implicit in Monahan's analysis was that marriage orients men and women toward the future, asking them not just to commit to each other, but to a plan, to earn, to save, and to devote themselves to advancing their children's prospects. Single mothers in the ghetto, on the other hand, tend to drift into pregnancy, often more than once and by more than one man, and to float through the chaos around them. Last week, me and Roger talked to a young lady that actually called in to the show, complaining about black men and wanting to be married. And once Roger started digging into her story, I think she was in New York. New York or Detroit. She fit this exact case, almost to the letter, to the T. Single mother raised, got a job, but she had 4 kids out of wedlock with 4 different guys, trying to find love. She was socialized. This is socialization. Such mothers are unlikely to shape their children's character and ability in ways that lead to upward mobility. Separate and unequal families, in other words, meant that blacks would have their liberty, but they would be strangers to equality. Hence, Monahan's a national effort towards the problems of the Negro Americans must be directed towards the question of family structure. Even Martin Luther King said the same thing. Astonishingly, even for that surprising time, the Johnson administration agrees. Prompted by Monahan's still unpublished study, Johnson delivered a speech at the Howard University commencement call for the next, more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. The president began his speech with the era's conventional civil rights language, condemning inequality and calling for more funding of medical care, training, and education for Negroes. But he also broke into new territory, analyzing that the family problem with what strikes the contemporary ear as shocking candor. He announced, Negro poverty is not white poverty. He described the breakdown of the Negro family structure, which he said was the consequence of ancient brutality and past injustice and present prejudice. Is that them not admitting their fault and their blame for the state of the Negro family? I don't know what y'all read. I think you guys read with your heart and your emotions instead of what's on the paper. When the family collapses, it is the children that are usually damaged. Do y'all hear me? Johnson continues, when it happens on a massive scale, the community itself is crippled. Do we not say that continually? Because when y'all beg black men to come back and marry single mothers and get jobs and support the community, y'all saying the exact fucking same thing. But these are racist. Johnson was to call this his greatest civil rights speech. but he was just about the only one to see it that way. By the summer, Moynihan report was his inspiration was under attacks from all sides. Civil servants in the permanent government at Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE, and at the Children's Bureau muttered about the report's subtle racism. Academics picked apart its statistics. Black leaders like the Congress of Racial Equality Corps Director Floyd McKissick scolded that rather than the family, it's a damn system that needs changing, which they would agree with you. Moynihan was saying the same thing. You need to change the system. In part, the hostility was an accident of timing. Just days after the report was leaked to Newsweek in early August, LA's Watts ghetto exploded. The televised images of the South Central Los Angeles rioters burning down their own neighborhood collided in the public mind with the contents of the report. Some concluded that the tangle of pathology was the administration's explanation for urban riots, a view quieted odds with the civil rights leaders' determination to portray the violence as an outpouring of black despair over white injustice. Moreover, given the fresh wounds of segregation, persistent brutality against blacks, ugly tenaciousness of racism, the fear of white backsliding, and the sense of injured pride that one can hear in so many of Moynihan's critics are entirely understandable. Less forgivable was the refusal to grapple seriously, either at the time or in the months, years, or even decades to come, was the basic cultural insight contained in the report that ghetto families were at risk of raising generations of children unable to seize the opportunity that civil rights movement had opened up for them. Instead, critics changed the subject, accusing Moynihan, wrongfully, as any honest reading of the Negro family proves, of ignoring joblessness and discrimination. Family instability as a peripheral issue, warned Whitney Young, executive director of the National Urban League. The problem is discrimination. The protest generating the most buzz came from William Ryan, a core activist in Savage Discovery, the Moynihan Report, published in The Nation, later reprinted in the NAACP's official publication. Ryan, though a psychologist, did not hear Moynihan's point as the family goes, so goes the children. He heard code for the archaic charge of black licentiousness. He described the report as a highly sophomoric treatment of illegitimacy, and instead that whites brought access to abortion, contraception, and adoption hid the fact that they were no less promiscuous than blacks. Most memorably, he accused Moynihan of blaming the victim, a phrase that would become the title of his 1971 book and the fear-inducing censor of the future, plain speaking about the ghetto's decay. That Ryan's phrase turned out to have more cultural staying power than anything in the Moynihan Report is a tragic emblem of the course of the subsequent discussion about the ghetto. For white liberals in the black establishment, poverty became a zero-sum game. Either you believed, as they did, that there was a defect in the system, or you believed that there was a defect in the individual. Sounds like collectivists versus liberals. Okay. It was as if critiquing the family meant that you supported inferior schools, even that you were a racist, though the Negro family had been a masterpiece of complex analysis that implied that individuals are intricately intertwined in a variety of systems, familiar, cultural, and economic. It gave birth to a hardened either-or politics from which the country has barely recovered. By autumn, when the White House Conference on Civil Rights took place, the Moynihan Report, initially planned as the centerpiece, had been disappeared. Johnson himself, having just introduced large numbers of ground troops into Vietnam, went mum on the subject, steering clear of the word family in the next State of the Union message. This was a moment when the nation had the references. The leadership, the president, had been overwhelmingly elected, had the largest majorities in the House and Senate since the New Deal, and the will to make a total commitment to the cause of Negro equality. Moynihan lamented in a 1967 post-mortem of his report in the commentary. Instead, he declared the nation had disastrously decided to punt Johnson's next and most profound stage in the battle for civil rights. The issue of the Negro family was dead. In fact, I think Moynihan called it a moment lost. Well, not exactly. Over the next 15 years, the black family's question was actually became a growth industry inside academia, the foundations, and the government. But it wasn't the same family that had worried Moynihan and that in the real world continued to self-destruct at unprecedented rates. Scholars invented a fantasy family, strong and healthy, a poor man's Brady Bunch, whose function was not to reflect truth, but to soothe injured black self-esteem and to bolster the emerging feminist critique of male privilege, bourgeois individualism, and the nuclear family. The literature of this period was so evasive, so implausible, so far removed from what was really unfolding in the ghetto that if you didn't know better, you might conclude that people actually wanted to keep the black family separate and unequal. Consider one of the first books out of the gate, Black Families in White America by Andrew Billingsley, published in 1968 and still referred to as seminal. Unlike Moynihan and others, we do not view the Negro as a casual nexus in a tangle of pathologies which feeds upon itself. He declared, the Negro family, in our view, is absorbing, adaptive, and amazingly resilient mechanism for the socialization of its children and the civilization of its society. Pay no attention to the 25% of poor ghetto families, Billingsley urged. Think instead about the 75% of middle-class families, of black middle-class families, though Moynihan had made a special point of exempting them from his report. He sure did. He sure did. Other black pride-inspired scholars looked at female-headed families and declared them authentically African. Really. And therefore a good thing. Wait a minute. Other black pride-inspired scholars looked at the female-headed families and declared them authentically African, therefore a good thing. You can't make this shit up, boy. They actually praise single mother black families. In a related vein, Carol Stack published All Our Kin, a 1974 Hugh-funded study of families in a Midwestern ghetto with many multi-generational female families. In an implicit criticism of American individualism, Stack depicted the Flats, as she dubbed her setting, as a vibrant and cooperative urban village where mutual aid, including from sons, brothers, uncles, who provided financial support among strong models for children, created a tenacious, active, lifelong network. Can't make this shit up, man. You cannot make this shit up. They praise the gynocracy. In fact, some scholars continued, maybe the nuclear family was really just a toxic white hang-up anyway. No one asked what the nuclear families did or how they prepared children for a modern economy. The important point was simply that they were not black. One must question the validity of the white middle-class lifestyle from its very foundation, because it has already proven itself to be decadent and unworthy of emulation. You can't make this shit up. Wrote Joyce Ladner, who became the first female president of Howard University. In her 1972 book, Tomorrow's Tomorrow, Robert Hill of the Urban League, who published The Strengths of Black Families the same year, claimed to have uncovered science that proved Ladner's point. Research studies have revealed that many one-parent families are more intact or cohesive than many two-parent families. Data on child abuse, battered wives, runaway children indicate higher rates among two-parent families in the suburban areas than the one-parent families in inner-city communities. The science, needless to say, was as reliable as a deadbeat dad. And we gotta remember, because Amiri was saying to me that we should not trust social scientists, right? So-called social scientists, and actually accept what's here, right? Accept these people, okay? That were black, liberal social scientists writing in 1972, male and female, okay? Male and female. And these are the people that trigger that Moynihan was racist, and the Moynihan report was tone deaf, and Moynihan was a neo-conservative, amongst other things, right? Feminists similarly fixated on overturning the oppressive idea of the nuclear family, also welcomed this dubious scholarship. Convinced that marriage was the main arena of male privilege, feminists projected onto the struggling single mother an image of the strong black woman who had always had to work and who was superior in terms of her ability to function healthily in the world. As Toni Morrison put it, the lucky black single mother could also enjoy more equal relationships with men than her miserably married white sister. You can't make this stuff up, right? If black pride made it hard to grapple with increasingly separate and unequal family, feminism made it impossible. Fretting about single-parent families was now not only racist, but also sexist. I just saw that. I just saw that in a tweet. Any effort to deny women their independence, their sexuality, or both. As for the poverty of single mothers, that was simply more proof of the patriarchal oppressions. As for the poverty of single mothers, that was simply more proof of patriarchal oppression. In 1978, the University of Wisconsin researcher Dana Pierce introduced the most useful term, feminization of poverty. But for her and her many allies, the problem was not the crumbling of the nuclear family. It was the lack of government support for single women and the failure of business to pay women their due. So white women weren't really concerned about the black family, they were concerned about themselves and their wanted independence of their white men, which they did not take. During that time period, even though there was divorce, a lot of these white women remarried. They didn't stay single. With the benefit of embarrassed hindsight, academics today sometimes try to wave away these notions as justifiably angry, but ultimately harmless. With the benefit of embarrassed hindsight, academics today sometimes try to wave away these notions as justifiably angry, but ultimately harmless speculations of political and academic activists. The depth and influence of the radicalism of the late 1960s and early 1970s are often exaggerated. Historian Stephanie Coontz writes in her new book, Marriage, A History from Obedience to Intimacy, or How Love Conquered Marriage, this is pure revisionism. The radical delegitimization of the family was so pervasive that even people at the center of power joined in. It made no difference that so many of these cheerleaders for single mothers had themselves spent their lives in traditional families and probably would rather have cut off an arm than see their own unmarried daughters pushing strollers. True. They talked the talk but didn't walk the walk. Take, for instance, Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, who wrote a concurring assent in the 1977 Moore versus City of East Cleveland decision. The case concerned a woman and her grandson evicted from a housing project following a city ordinance that defined family as parents or parent and their own children. Brennan did not simply agree with the court should rule in favor of the grandmother, a perfectly reasonable position. He also assured the court that the extended family has as many strengths not shared by the nuclear family. Relying on Robert Hill's science, he declared that delinquency, addiction, crime, neurotic disabilities, and mental illness were more prevalent in societies where autonomous nuclear families prevail. A conclusion that would have bewildered the writers of the Constitution that Brennan was supposedly interpreting. In other words, the liberals are on board with this shit. In its bumbling way and far-reaching political consequences, the executive branch also offered warm greetings to the single-parent family. Okay, it wasn't just about black folks, okay? Alert to growing apprehension about the state of the American family during the 1976 presidential campaign, Jimmy Carter had promised a conference on the subject. Clearly less concerned with the conditions in the ghetto than with satisfying feminist advocates, the administration named a black single divorced mother to lead the event, occasioning an outcry from conservatives. By 1980, when it finally convened after numerous postponements, the White House Conference on the Family had morphed into the White House Conference on Families to signal that all family forms were equal. Instead of the political victory for moderate Democrats that Carter had expected, the conference galvanized religious conservatives. Later, conservative heavyweight Paul Weyrich observed that the Carter Conference marked the moment when religious activists moved in force into Republican politics. Doubtless, they were also more energized by their own issues of feminism, gay rights than by what was happening in the ghetto, but their new rallying cry of family values nonetheless became a political dividing line, with unhappy fallout for liberals for years to come. Meanwhile, partisans of single motherhood got a perfect chance to test their theories, since urban ghettos were fast turning into nuclear family free zones. Indeed, by 1980, 15 years after the Negro family, the out-of-wedlock birth rate among blacks had more than doubled to 56%. In the ghetto, that number was considerably higher, as high as 66% in New York City. Many experts comforted themselves by pointing out that white mothers were also beginning to forego marriage, but the truth was only 9% of white births occurred out of wedlock. That's what I'm saying. They talked the talk, but they didn't walk the walk. And how was the black single-parent family doing? It would be fair to say that it had not been exhibiting the strengths of kinship networks. And if you know what, Diane Stewart's still parodying this stuff, right? This stuff is not going away. You have modern day feminists talking about kinship networks. According to numbers crunched by Monahan and economist Paul Offner, of the black children born between 1967 and 1969, 72% received aid to families with dependent children before the age of 18. School dropout rates, delinquency, and crime, among other dysfunctions that the Monahan report had warned about, were rising in the cities. In short, in the 15 years since the report was written, it had witnessed both the births of millions of fatherless babies and an entrenchment of an underclass. Liberal advocates had two main ways of dodging the subject of family collapse while still addressing its increasingly alarming fallout. The first, largely the creation of Marian Wright Edelman, who in 1973 founded the Children's Defense Fund, was to talk about children not as the offspring of individual mothers and fathers responsible for rearing them, but as an oppressed class living in generic, nebulous, and never to be analyzed families. Framing the problem of the ghetto children in this way, CDF was able to mount a powerful case for the host of services, from prenatal care to daycare to housing subsidies, in the name of children's developmental needs, which did not seem to include either a stable domestic life or, for that matter, fathers, which is true. It's where a lot of your Section 8 came from, or increased Section 8. Advocates like Edelman might not have viewed the collapsing ghetto family as a welcome occurrence, but they treated it as a kind of natural event, like drought beyond human control and judgment. As recently as a year ago, marking the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, CDF announced on its website in 2004 it's morally and economically indefensible. A black preschool child is as 3 times likely to depend solely on a mother's earnings. This might strike many as a pretty good argument for addressing the prevalence of black single mother families, but in CDS speak, it is a case for federal natural disaster relief. That's funny. In fact, pouring more money. The Children's Defense Fund was only the best known child advocacy group to impose a gag rule on the role of fatherlessness families in the plight of its putative constituents. The Carnegie Corporation followed suit. In 1977, it published a highly influential report by Keniston called All Our Children and the American Family Under Pressure. It makes an obligatory nod toward the family's role in raising children, before calling for a cut in unemployment, a federal job guarantee, national health insurance, affirmative action, and a host of other children's programs. Monahan under Nixon said the exact same thing. Job guarantee. He actually called for a basic family income that looks more like the UBI. That never really got going. In a review and commentary, Nathan Glazer noted ruefully that All Our Children was part of a recent spat of books and articles about the subject of the family that have had little, if anything, to say about the black family in particular, and the matter seemed to have been permanently shelved. For that silence, children's advocates deserve much of the credit or blame. The second way not to talk about what was happening to the ghetto family was to talk instead about teen pregnancy. In 1976, the Alan Guttmacher Institute, Planned Parenthood's research arm, published 11 million teenagers. What can be done about the epidemic of adolescent pregnancy in the United States? It was a report that launched 1,000 programs. In response to its alarms, Chief Joseph Califano helped push through the 1978 Adolescent Health Services Pregnancy Prevention and Care Act, which funded groups providing services to pregnant adolescents and teen moms. Nonprofits, including the Center for Population Options, now called Advocates for Youth, climbed on the bandwagon. The Ford and Robert Wood Johnson Foundation showered dollars on organizations that ran school-based health clinics. The Charles Stewart Mott Foundation set up the Too Early Childbearing Network. The Annie Casey Foundation sponsored a community strategy for reaching sexually active adolescents. The Carnegie, Ford, and William T. Grant Foundations all started demonstration programs. There was just one small problem. There was no epidemic of teen pregnancy. There was an out-of-wedlock teen pregnancy epidemic. Teenagers had gotten pregnant at even higher rates in the past. The numbers had reached their zenith in the 1950s, and the 11 million teenagers cited in the Guttmacher report actually had represented a decline in the rate of pregnant teens. Back in the day, however, when they found that they were pregnant, girls had either gotten married or given up their babies for adoption. Not this generation. They were used to seeing children growing up without fathers, and they felt no shame about arriving at the maternity ward with no rings on their fingers, even at 15. That's what I say. Shame went out of the window in the 1970s. In the middle class mind, however, no sane girl will want to have a baby at 15. Not that experts mouthing rhetoric about the oppressive patriarchal family would admit that there was anything wrong with that the middle class outlook combined with the post-Moynihan mendacity about the growing disconnect between ghetto childbearing and marriage led the policy elites to frame what was really the broad cultural problem of the separate and unequal families as a simple lack of reproductive services. Ergo, girls at risk must need sex education and contraceptive services. You also had a big Planned Parenthood push on purpose by Republicans. Can anybody say George W. Bush? I should say George H. Bush. But the truth was that underclass girls often wanted to have babies. They didn't see it as a problem that they were young and unmarried. They did not follow the middle class life script that read protracted adolescence, college, first job, marriage, and only then children. Marry before you carry. They did not share the belief that the children needed mature, educated mothers who would make their youngsters' development the center of their lives. Access to birth control couldn't change any of that. At any rate, failing to define the problem accurately, advocates were in no position to find the solution. Teen pregnancy not only failed to go down, despite all the public attention, the tens of millions of dollars in the birth control pills that were thrown its way, it went up, peaking in 1990 at 117 pregnancies per 1,000 teenage girls, up from 105 per 1,000 in 1978. When the Guttmacher report was published, about 80% of those young girls who had become mothers were single, and the vast majority would be poor. Throughout the 1980s, the inner city and the black family continued to unravel. Child poverty stayed close to 20%, hitting a high of 22.7%. In 1993, welfare dependency continued to rise, soaring from 2 million families in 1970 to 5 million by 1995. By 1990, 65% of all black children were being born to unmarried women. In ghetto communities like Central Harlem, the number was close to 80%. By this point, no one doubted that most of these children were destined to grow up poor and to pass down the legacy of single parenting to their own children. The only good news was that the bad news was unrelentingly bad, that the usual bromides and evasions could no longer hold. Something had to shake up what amounted to ideological paralysis. And that something came from conservatives. Three thinkers, in particular Charles Murray, Lawrence Mead, Thomas Sowell, though they did not always write directly about the black family, effectively changed the conversation about it. First, they did not flinch from blunt language in describing the wreckage of the inner city, unafraid of the accusations of racism and victim blaming that came their way. Secondly, they pointed at the welfare policies of the 1960s, not racism or lack of jobs or the legacy of slavery, as the cause of inner city dysfunction. And in doing so, they made the welfare mother the public symbol of the ghetto ills. Murray, in particular, argued that welfare money provided a disincentive for marriage, which is true. And while his theory may have overstated the roles of economics, it's worth noting that he was probably the first to grasp that the country was turning into a nation of separate and unequal families. And third, they believed that poor would have to change their behavior instead of waiting for Washington to end poverty, as liberals seem to be saying. By the early 1980s, the media had woken up to the ruins of the ghetto family and brought about the return of the repressed Moynihan Report, declaring Moynihan prophetic. Ken Auletta, in his 1982 The Underclass, proclaimed that one cannot talk about poverty in America or about the underclass without talking about the weakening family structure of the poor. Both the Baltimore Sun and the New York Times ran a series on the black family in 1983. I actually did read that, followed by a 1985 Newsweek article called "The Moynihan I Told You So." And in 1986 CBS documentary, The Vanishing Black Family, produced by Bill Moyers, we actually play that all the time. A one-time aide to Lyndon Johnson, who has supported the Moynihan Report. The most symbolic moment came when Moynihan himself gave Harvard's prestigious Godkin Lectures in 1985 in commemoration 20th anniversary of the Negro family. For the most part, liberals were having none of it. They piled on Murray's 1984 Losing Ground, ignored Mead and Sowell, excoriated the word underclass, which they painted as recycled pseudoscientific version of the tangle of pathology. But there were two important exceptions to this long list of deniers. First was William Julius Wilson. In his 1987 Truly Disadvantaged, Wilson chastised liberals for being confused and defensive and failing to engage the social pathologies of the ghetto. Wilson is black. The average poor black child today appears to be in the midst of a poverty spell which will last for almost 2 decades, he warned. And it has. Liberals have to propose thoughtful explanations for the rise in inner city dislocations. Ironically, though Wilson's own mismatched theory for family breakdown, which hypothesized that the movement of low-skilled jobs out of the cities has sharply reduced the number of marriageable black men, had the effect of extending liberals' defensiveness about the damaged ghetto family. This is when the language shifted. Instead of blaming single mothers, they started blaming men without jobs. Okay, they started blaming black men instead. After all, poor single mothers were only adapting to economic conditions. How could they do otherwise? The research of another social scientist, Sarah McClanahan, was not so easily rationalized, however. A divorced mother herself, McClanahan found Auletta's depiction of her single-parent counterparts in the inner city disturbing, especially because, like other sociologists of the time, she had been taught that the Moynihan Report was the work of racists, or at least a seriously deluded man. When she surveyed the science available on the subject, she realized that the research was so sparse that no one knew for sure how the children of her single mothers were faring. Over the next decade, McClanahan analyzed whatever numbers she could find, and discovered, lo and behold, that single children in single-parent homes were not doing as well as children from two-parent homes on a wide variety of measures, from income to school performance and to teen pregnancy. Throughout the late 80s and 90s, McClanahan presented her emerging findings over protests from feminists and the Children's Defense Fund. Finally, in 1994, she published with Gary Sandefur, Grown Up with a Single Parent. McClanahan's research shocked social scientists into re-examining the problem they had presumed was not a problem. It was a turning point. One by one, the top family researchers gradually came around, concluding that McClanahan, perhaps even Monahan, was right. In fact, by the early 1990s, when the ghetto was finally at its nadir, public opinion had clearly turned. No one was more attuned to this shift than triangulator Bill Clinton, who made the family a centerpiece of his domestic policy. In his 1994 State of the Union address, he announced, "We cannot renew our country when, within a decade, more than half our children will be born to families where there is no marriage." And in 1996, despite the howls of indignation, including from members of his own administration, Mr. Finally from Monahan himself, he signed a welfare reform bill that he had twice vetoed, and that included among its goals increasing the number of children living with two parents. So have we reached the end of the Monahan Report saga? That would be vastly overstating matters. Remember, 70% of black children are still born to unmarried mothers. After all that ghetto dwellers have been through, why are so many people still unwilling to call this the calamity it is? Both now and the National Association of Social Welfare Workers continue to see marriage as a potential source of female oppression. The Children's Defense Fund still won't touch the subject. Hip-hop culture glamorizes ghetto life because nowadays it's like a badge of honor to be a baby mama or baby daddy. Go the words to the current hit Baby Mama, which young ghetto mothers view as their anthem. Seriously complicating the issue is the push for gay marriage, which dismissed the formula. Children grow up with their own married parents as a form of discrimination. And then there is the American penchant for to each his own, libertarianism. In opinion polls, a substantial majority of young people say that having a child outside of marriage is okay. Though, judging from their behavior, they seem to mean that it's okay for them, but not for other people. Middle and upper class Americans act as if they know that marriage provides a structure that protects children's development, if only they were willing to admit it to their fellow citizens. All told, the nation is at a cultural inflection point that pretends change, though they always caution that marriage is not a panacea. Social scientists almost uniformly accept the research that confirms the benefits for children growing up with their own married parents. Welfare reform and tougher child support regulations have reinforced the message of personal responsibility for one's children. The Bush administration unabashedly uses the word marriage in its welfare policies. There are even raw numbers to support the case for optimism. Teen pregnancy, which finally started to decline in the mid-1990s, is in response to CRISPR. Teen pregnancy is a bad idea cultural message is now at its lowest rate ever. And finally, in the ghetto itself, there is a growing feeling that mother-only families don't work. That's why people are lining up to see an aging comedian as he voices some not-so-funny opinions about their own parenting. I think they were talking about Bill Cosby. That's why so many young men are vowing to be the fathers they never had. That's Generation X. Dr. Johnson talks about that all the time. And that's why there's been an uptick, albeit small, in the number of black children living with their married parents. If change really is in the air, it's taken 40 years to get here. 40 years of inner city misery for the country to reach a point with which it fully signed onto the lesson of Monahan's report. Yes, it's better late than never, but you could forgive lost generations of ghetto men, women, and children if they found it cold comfort. That's from the City Journal of the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. A very long article, very intense, okay? But it says the same thing, particularly that even 10 years later, Patterson said when he wrote his book, Freedom is Not Enough, where he actually goes through this more in depth and in detail. But a lot of this stuff that Monahan said got implemented too late. We're saying it now. We're saying it now about single mothers. We're saying it now about babies out of wedlock. We're saying it now about a whole host of other things, right? We're saying it now. Even the conservative and liberal black people are saying the same thing, right? Black male employment, getting families off of welfare. They're actually blaming white people for welfare for the breakup of the black family. When the history says that they have been battling this for a long time, it wasn't the conservative black white folks talking about it, right, was actually liberal and black liberals writing books, writing papers that actually co-signed this shit. So we always, make this blanket statement that it was a white conspiracy plot to break up black families by giving black women money, the same money that they gave white women for 30 years before they started giving it to black women. But it's a plot by allowing black women to have the same rights that everybody else does. Thing is, you never fix the internal problems that the black family had, and all the money they put into welfare, put into Section 8, put into single mothers. All this money they put into it, they could have put it into the black family had they listened to Moynihan. The thing is, what Moynihan was saying, the money should not have gone to, I don't care what you think about it, into necessarily keeping black mothers single or encouraging black motherhood. Should have went into the boys, should have went into the men, educating them, making sure they got jobs, making sure they had careers to take care of their families. That's what Moynihan was saying. Okay. Even now, it's still backwards. And, the black women and black liberals are still fighting that notion. They still want to pour the money into the women instead of pouring money into the men. The bulk of the money, as Moynihan said back then, should have been put into the men, especially the young men, especially the boys. If you give the black boys what they need to be men and be successful, you'll heal the black family. That was Moynihan's most ringing endorsement about how he thought about solving a problem. He was a part of the Department of Labor. He saw it as a labor problem for the most part, not a social problem, not a social worker problem, but as a labor problem. And his solution was put the money into the men, put the money into education, put the money into making a better education for the underclass that still is the underclass, which is black boys, which never got heeded because black women and white feminists thought that marriage in what they call patriarchal marriage was oppressive, and single motherhood was the highest virtue. That was in 1970s by not only white feminists but also black liberals. But nobody talks about that. Like this article says, they turned out to be wrong, but nobody wants to talk about that. But anyway, man, I got a long article. It was rough because I'm not used to reading long articles like this. I probably need more practice, but I'm gonna edit this. I'm gonna get this out and get this up, and y'all can have at it. But with that being said, and as always, this is BGS out, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace out.